In September of 1974, Ted Bundy moved into this house, which is just down the road from the main temple in Salt Lake City. He converted to LDS and, he became a Mormon. He was accepted into the University of Utah Law School, which was very prestigious, and it was kind of a boarding house, so he stayed in room number 2, which could be accessed via this ladder. And it's said, in kind of Ted Bundy lore, that he would use the ladder to avoid being seen and rousing suspicion from the landlord of the house. But apparently this house, don't come here and knock on their door. They're dealing with a lot of people who do this. They're real idiots. They're fine with photos, but nothing more really. And again, if you look down this main street right here, Ted Bundy would kind of like a snake just morph into whatever the dominant political or social structure was in the area he was in at the time. And that is kind of the church administrative building, and just behind it, behind the trees, is the temple. And they say that by the time he got here, he'd already abducted and killed 8 women in Oregon and Washington, but some investigators think it was a lot more, and certainly he used this house as a sort of base of operations for women that he would kill in Idaho, Utah, and Colorado. And the law school was just down the road here, and he would go hang out up near the canyon where the Donner Party passed through, Immigration Canyon, near Ensign Peak, or this is the place, Park rather, and you would find them, and the rumor says take them into the woods and kill them in a shed, but there's a lot of question about the truth of that rumor. People like to talk about them. In fact, I've seen one journalist talk about going to this cafe right here and talking to somebody in there, and they claimed, oh, my friend was, rooming in the old place where Ted Bundy would stay, in room number 2, and, oh, their personality changed. This is feeding into Ted Bundy's lies. He's a manipulator even after getting into jail, and I was surprised looking into true crime in Utah just how many killers and shooters and just evil psychopaths, they will claim that they were controlled by a demon, because that convinces the governor, who's usually a Christian man, to spare their life and not give them the death sentence. And it also makes them a friend of Christian conservative groups, which Ted Bundy, that was his whole thing. He kind of sought refuge in them, and a lot of people still say he's a changed man and demons and pornography made him do it, going to lend more veracity to the whole satanic ritual up in Bountiful, which never happened.
When I was visiting friends on the West Coast a couple years ago, I decided to do a tour of Ted Bundy places. Places that he killed people, where he was active, where he grew up, and I wanted to start at his childhood home. This would be in Tacoma, and it wasn't far away from his high school. And also, there was a very strange disappearance of a 14-year-old girl, Anne Marie Burr. This is his childhood home. Very few people explored the history of this home, even though he was kind of implicated, or it was suggested that he might have killed Anne Marie Burr when he was 14. Now, serial killers, as prolific as Ted Bundy, oftentimes they'll explore what they like, their methodology, their victim type, and Anne Marie Burr could have been in that exploration. In fact, I believe I've heard some of the only times that Ted Bundy showed regret were the incredibly young girls. Usually they were 18, 17, 16, but people like Anne Marie Burr, if Ted Bundy actually killed her, he probably would have been filled with regret. And it was at this house in Tacoma that he grew up with his family. It was just down the road from the Woodrow Wilson High School. And this is actually where he kind of majored. He built up a reputation here as being kind of a very bright student. He was in the high school yearbook in political science class, and it was here that he went over to the University of Puget Sound for a year before transferring over to the University of Washington. Naturally, this school has kind of tried to distance themselves with their most notable alumni, and there's very little online about it. But if you Google the school, that's pretty much the first thing you'll find. It's a lot of true crime people, and I do think that it's pretty toxic to idolize Ted Bundy. Obviously, he was a very, very bad dude, but it's interesting to imagine him walking from his house to this school. I mean, it's not very far away, at least if I remember right. It's only like a mile or two away. And Ted Bundy was kind of a glass person here. He had a very superficial personality. He went to political science because he wanted to kind of blend in with people, do people things. This is another photo of Anne Marie Burr, who he could have killed there at his time. It was only 4 years after this girl died that he went to that high school, and this is the University of Puget Sound. He was here for about a year, and he was studying political science before he went to the University of Washington to learn Chinese. And it's interesting, he kind of just starts to abandon his political science aspirations. He works for the Nelson Rockefeller campaign, 1968, for president,
That's his
the
residence.
Washington chapter of that. But then he went to go learn Chinese, and then he went to go learn law to kind of snub his ex girlfriend who broke up with him. And he was just doing whatever he could do to get
It's actually a pretty
in
nice
with
place.
people. And it's very much like he's not even human. It's just, oh, people do this. I'm going to go and do that. Anyway, this is Nelson Rockefeller. It was Bundy. It was kind of his first political dalliance. He went to go try to advocate for him, and this is the Memorial Chapel. They would hold meetings in here. He would canvass for Nelson Rockefeller. He went, I think, to Florida as a part of the Rockefeller campaign. He was also the bodyguard for the lieutenant governor when he was campaigning in Washington, but he was later dropped. And we were about to hear Nelson Rockefeller's little announcement of running for president as he was in Washington state. Kind of interesting.
Today I announce my active candidacy for the nomination by the Republican Party for the presidency of the United States.
And here back at the university, I didn't get the time to visit the University of Washington. I think this is actually another interesting one. There may have been a couple of girls who went missing around this time, but he was only here for a year before he went to the big city, the University of Washington. But this was only down the road from his house. There's a lot of people who say, oh, he lived on this street or that street, but in reality, he was just living with his parents in the same house he grew up in, and he kind of wanted to get out and go to the University of Washington. And here we're in Utah, which is where I'm actually based. So I got to see a lot of stuff. I'm planning on seeing the Ted Bundy murder cave and all that, but that's a video in itself. We're driving past where the Ogden Hi-Fi murders happened. These were, well, it was a robbery gone wrong, and there was a airman. These were all airmen from the nearby Hill Air Force Base who did this. They walked into the hi-fi shop and they tried robbing it, and when it started going south, they moved all the people in the shop to the back and made them drink Drano. They basically said, open your mouth, and they poured a bunch of Drano in there and then duct taped their mouth shut. And the people who survived said, we didn't really know what was happening. We thought it could just be water. They were just toying with us, but three of them died, and I know for a fact at least one of the killers who was executed for it. Incredibly brutal way that it happened, and it really impacted the way the community viewed the Air Force at the time. Incredibly sad. But just down the road from that, you have the grave of Deborah Jean Kent. And Kent, I don't believe, was ever found. She was one of those girls that Ted Bundy killed when he was based out of Salt Lake City. And while he was studying law here, he would murder women in Idaho, Utah, and Colorado, and this is kind of where he reached his peak of killing. Out of Salt Lake City, he would go especially into the nearby canyons, and he would prowl for women, usually out hiking, or it would be kind of in a wooded area, and he'd pick you up in his VW Bug, and he kind of sometimes he would promise, oh, I'll get you out of this place, you deserve better, kind of as a way to get you in his car, and then he would take you to a secluded spot and kill you. I don't want to go into details of how he killed Deborah Jean Kent because it was particularly brutal, and Deborah Kent was very young, and I don't believe, again, she was ever found. Very sad, but Ted Bundy really liked to keep the location of the bodies a secret. As I went to go try to see his house in downtown Salt Lake, which I'll do another video on that, passed by this pro-life rally. Kind of interesting. I just ended up as a part of the rally very weirdly. This is the temple, the main temple in Salt Lake Square that dates back to kind of the origination of the LDS Church in Salt Lake City. Um, an incredibly interesting and important landmark. This is the law school that Ted Bundy went to, and it was just down the road from his house, a walking distance. And because he was a glass person, he would walk to the law school and then he would walk up to Immigration Canyon, which is Donner Summit. And Donner Summit, the first people to come through there were the Donner Party. And they would later cannibalize each other. And then along came the Mormons about a year later, and Ted Bundy came in the 1970s. But they say that back here you've got his cave or his death shack, and there's a lot of places in Salt Lake City that are kind of rumored to be Ted Bundy hotspots, but aren't really.
Here in Murray City, Utah, just south of Salt Lake, is Ted Bundy's 10th victim, 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox. And I just wanted to tell her story, and if any of the family is still alive, I would like to say, I really do hope that the father forgave himself. I mean, there is nothing to forgive. He didn't do anything wrong, but people tend to blame themselves during times of tragedy like this. Nancy Wilcox, who was 16, she got into a fight with her father, and she stormed out of her home and onto the road. Well, Ted Bundy was patrolling the streets in his yellow VW Bug, and he saw her and either offered to give her a ride or forced her into the car or something. But I don't want to detail how he murdered her. Ted Bundy, I don't know why people kind of idolize Ted Bundy as a true crime icon. He was a horrible, horrible person, probably one of the worst killers, but people get lost in the details of what he looks like and how productive he was, rather than the brutality that he would murder people with. And so he confessed to her death. It was one of his last confessions in 1989, but like many others, he was just a real asshole and refused to say where her body was. So there is no date of death on her grave. The family still held out hope for many years that they might be able to find her. And right here, we're kind of just down the road from where Ted Bundy's house was, his boarding house. All up on the left, you have kind of student housing. This is the law school in Utah. I'll talk a little bit more about it. I don't know too much about it. I haven't really watched all the documentaries, mostly last podcast on the left. But, Ted Bundy kind of picked this school because, his friends said, oh, it's because he knows it's a hidden gem. But in reality, Ted Bundy he kind of liked the Midwest area for his victim type. Good Mormon girls, conservative women.
The thing is that he was ending up on a shorter and shorter list during this time period because people were like, a man in a cast, man in crutches, man pretending to be a police officer. He always would introduce himself as Ted. As an officer, he was Officer Ted Roseland.
I mean, for how creative he was when, to get these women with these sort of different, act outs and different characters who would play. You would think he would change his name.
And here we are in the canyon, just a little bit to the east of American Fork, Utah. And the story here that's been made famous on TikTok is that if you cross the little stream here, you can find Ted Bundy's cave up there. And I wanted to go over this a little bit because I've heard this rumor myself, but I heard it before it took off on TikTok. And I feel that what they're doing on TikTok is incredibly irresponsible to the victims. They are going in there and saying they still feel the spirit of Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy might have picked up an individual, a single woman, in this canyon because it's a popular spot for hikers. You're right near the Timpanogos caves, and it's kind of popular for women to go out, get their exercise. And he claimed that he took Nancy Wilcox in one interview back to his house. But in reality, Ted Bundy, he didn't think his killings through enough. He would incapacitate women by hitting them with a crowbar or a hammer, and then taking them to the nearest concealed area to torture and kill them. So the idea of him bringing several women to this cave, just across this, they said that back in the day there was a bridge here, and they've had to seal it up probably because of the TikTok popularity of it, and you can no longer access the cave. They were saying that he would bring his woman back here, and he just wasn't that well thought out. He was an evil man, and he was a berserker killer through and through. And honestly, it's a beautiful spot, though, if you want to just come out here and see. One of the things I've noticed about Utah particularly is their penchant for telling tales about caves and mining. Specifically in the Uinta Wilderness, I've heard of 30 different Spanish gold mines, the Lost Roads gold mine, and Karashinab. And it's part of this weird plot oftentimes by people who own worthless land that's been overmined to try to sell the mine to somebody. And then they'll throw in, by the way, Ted Bundy killed 5 women in this cave. and then you'll pay substantially more for it, hoping to kind of open it up as a haunted cave. But of course there's no validity, no police ever came here. He never said in any of his interviews that he came here. And the closest he got to it was saying that there was one woman that he, you know, captured in either this canyon or Immigration Canyon.